And I want to start out with my rant today that I published over at HartmannReport.com, free and commercial free. It's titled, "Are Trump and His Cronies Guilty of Mass Murder?" Seriously. I mean, all across America this past year and a half, 700,000 plus people have died an agonizing, terrifying, drowning in their own fluids death. Their relatives helpless, saying goodbye using Zoom or FaceTime. Families are broken and shattered. Husbands, wives, children, grandchildren left bereft. Doctors, nurses, and physician assistants dying along with them or holding their hands as they drew their final tortured breath. Many of these deaths were absolutely unnecessary. They happened because of very specific decisions made by a small group of people led by Donald Trump. Now, if you or I made any decision at all that led to the death of another person, we'd be on our way to prison. Case in point, you're driving down the street and you decide to send a text message while you're driving. And because you're not, you hit some poor guy and kill him. You go to prison. Trump not only caused 130,000 Americans to die, and that's according to Deborah Birx. It's probably the most conservative number out there. But he did it, and I'm going to build this case. You've heard this before, but I think it's important to summarize it again in one piece. But he did it because he believed that he could blame the deaths on blue state governors, on Democratic governors, and because the majority of the deaths were happening to black people. I think this is murder. By the definition of murder in the state of Florida, which I published in the article here, I won't read the whole thing to you, but this is clearly murder. Perpetrated by any act imminently dangerous to another and evincing a depraved mind regardless of human life. Well, there you go. From the first case of COVID on January 20th, 2020, until April 7th of 2020, for 4 months, Donald Trump and his team actually were trying to do something about the COVID pandemic. He put medical doctors on TV every day. The media was freaking out about refrigerated trucks carrying bodies away from New York hospitals. Doctors and nurses were our new national heroes. Remember this? By March 7th, U.S. deaths had risen from only 4 to only 22. But that was enough to create federal action. Trump's official emergency declaration came on March 11th. And it shut down most of the country. The Dow collapsed. Millions of Americans were laid off. But hey, we were trying to save lives, right? Jared Kushner put together an all-volunteer task force of mostly preppy 30-something young white men to coordinate getting PPE to hospitals. You know, they even had a plan for the post office to distribute 650 million masks, 5 to every American household, to stop the pandemic. And then came April 7th. April 7th, when the New York Times ran a front page story with the headline, "Black Americans Face Alarming Rates of Coronavirus Infection in Some States." Other media ran similar headlines all across the American media landscape that day. It was heavily reported on cable news and network news. Turns out most of the non-elderly people dying from COVID were black or Hispanic, not white people. And that very day, April 7th, when that was the lead news story on every media in the country, April 7th, 2020, Rush Limbaugh declared, "With the coronavirus, I have been waiting for the racial component, and here it is. The coronavirus now hits African Americans harder than illegal aliens, harder than women. It hits African Americans harder than anybody. Disproportionate representation." Now, it doesn't take a medical genius to figure out why any disease hits African Americans harder than white people and even Hispanics, because 400 years of institutional racism has conspired to prevent African Americans from having either the wealth or the access to health care that wealth can provide to have good health care. I mean, you know, it's fairly straightforward. It's the reason why 12 Republican-controlled states have continued to refuse to expand Medicaid, because they have large black populations and they don't want people of color to have health care. But, you know, that didn't matter to, I mean, the right wing didn't even think of that. They just thought, oh, it must be some kind of a race thing. Black people die from COVID, white people don't. And so that night, April 7th, Tucker Carlson went on TV and said, oh, look at this. We can, that's my phrase. Now, here's a quote from him. Quote, we can begin to consider how to improve the lives of the rest. The countless Americans who've been grievously hurt by this, by our response to this. How do we get 17 million of our most vulnerable citizens back to work? That's our task. He's talking about white people who need a job. White people are out of work. Black people were most of the casualties outside of the extremely elderly. Those white people needed their jobs back. Britt Hume joined Tucker Carlson that night, April 7th, and said, well, the disease turned out to not be quite as dangerous as we thought. Unspoken, dangerous for white people. 12,677 Americans were dead on April 7th. But now that Trump knew that they were mostly black people outside of the folks who were dying in nursing homes, it was time to quit talking about people dying and start talking about getting back to work. And it took Donald Trump less than a week to get the memo. On April 12th, he retweeted a call to fire Dr. Fauci. And in another tweet declared that he had sole authority to open the U.S. back up. On April 13th, the ultra-right-wing and pretty much entirely white-managed U.S. Chamber of Commerce published a policy paper titled Implementing a National Return to Work Plan. The next day, FreedomWorks, you know, the billionaire founded and funded group that animated the Tea Party against Obamacare 10 years ago, they published an op-ed on their website calling for an economic recovery and a shield for businesses from lawsuits. 3 days after that, FreedomWorks and the House Freedom Caucus, I call them the Cokehead Caucus, issued a joint statement declaring it's time to reopen the economy. They published their Reopen America Rally Planning Guide. It's still active. I've got a link to it in my article today. They said, show up in person at your state capitals and governor's mansions for your signage. Quote, keep it short. Things like I'm essential, let me work, let me feed my family, and keep the signs looking homemade. The first rally, the first Open the Country rally that FreedomWorks put together was April 19th in New Hampshire. Over the next several weeks, there were rallies in Oregon, Arizona, Delaware, North Carolina, Virginia, Illinois, and elsewhere. They were complete with swastikas, Confederate flags, and assault rifles. In fact, the number one that got the media was when they did it to Gretchen Carlson, the governor of Michigan. NBC News ran the headline. They got a hold of an email that month from the White House to Louis DeJoy. Trump administration scrapped plan to send every American a mask in April, email shows, was the headline over on NBC News. When Rachel Maddow pointed out that the meatpacking plants were epicenters of the virus infection because people were working so close to each other, the Chief Justice of the Wisconsin Supreme Court said, oh, that virus flare is not coming from regular folks. It's not white people who are getting sick in the meatpacking plants. It's the Hispanic and black people. The conservative meme was now, this is just the end of April, the conservative meme was now well established. And what did Trump do? He issued an executive order forcing the black and Hispanic people back to work in the meatpacking plants. Remember that? He wouldn't use the Defense Production Act to make PPE. He wouldn't use it to make test kits or vaccine, but no, he did use it to send Hispanic and black people back to work. And then you get Jared Kushner's expert COVID team. This was Catherine Eban over at Vanity Fair reported, quote, the political folks believed that because it was going to, the pandemic was going to be relegated to Democratic states, that they could blame those governors and that would be an effective strategy. Robert F. Kennedy Sr.'s grandson, Max Kennedy, was one of the volunteers who worked with Kushner. Jane Mayer wrote for The New Yorker, quote, Kennedy was disgusted to see that the political appointees who supervised him were hailing Trump as a marketing genius because, Kennedy said, they told him, Trump personally came up with the strategy of blaming the blue states. Remember back then, it was the virus was pretty much exclusively, in large part, in Washington State, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. By the end of the year, we ranked 5th worst in the world, behind Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and Iran. We had 20% of the world's COVID deaths. We're only 4% of the world's population. Why? Because Trump said, hey, it's only black people dying, and we can blame it on blue state governors. How is that not murder? How could anyone think that, at the very least, this is negligent homicide? And it sure looks like negligent murder to me. Sweden has put together a commission to look into their government's response to it. In Brazil, the Senate has compiled a 1,000-page report and said that Bolsonaro should be held guilty of crimes against humanity, of mass slaughter. And here in America, there's no major national commission, no special prosecutor looking into what happened. Now, if Obama had been president, you know what would have happened. They spent 4 years and multiple hearings, looking at 4 American deaths in Bengazi. They took thousands of hours of testimony. With Ken Starr, he had a $70 million budget, and him and Brett Kavanaugh spent 4 years going after Bill Clinton for getting a BJ from Monica Lewinsky. And Newt Gingrich said that endangers the survival of the American system of justice. Come on. Schumer and Pelosi need to put select committees on this, and Merrick Garland needs to empower and panel a special prosecutor with a grand jury.